the joke I want to make, that I'm hesitating between making and not making, that I should title the book The Sultan's Musicians, but so, thank you. Thank you, Aviad, thank you, Daniel, thank you to everyone for being here, panelists and participants. So I write about the outsized role played by Jewish music makers and purveyors of music, not just in Morocco, but in Algeria and Tunisia as well, from the beginning of the 20th century and until just after independence past mid-century. And it's that period that I want to think or rethink about with you on the initiative of Aviad. So I want to begin by noting that the inclusion of music and musicians into North African historiography, I believe in general is quite disruptive. So by including music and musicians in the narrative of nation and nationalism in the Maghreb, we find Jews who, for example, engaged in early 20th century musical nation-building projects, and I'm thinking here in particular of the establishment of music as an industry and the recording industry as well. We find Jews who released fiercely Arab nationalist records during the interwar period, and we find Jews who often remained in situ in the Maghreb as high-profile artists past independence, 1956 for Morocco and Tunisia, 1962 for Algeria, and into the period of decolonization. Again, it need be pointed out that these were incredibly high-profile musicians who were not necessarily sidelined during the early years of decolonization. And here I'm going to echo Alma in that remembering that there are high-profile musicians, many of whom who have been mentioned throughout this conference so far, Saïd al-Maghribi, Zora al-Fassia, and others. And the fact that Morocco will retain something close to 2/3 of its Jewish community until the end of the 1950s, I think allows us to rethink a straightforward narrative of decline. In other words, in addition to researching and writing about how Jews left, we need to also focus on how those Jews who remained lived, including those musicians whose rise to fame were framed between the years 1948 and 1956 or 1960. So for many musicians, 1948 was often the start of their career, Jewish musicians in Morocco. Still, eventually, and eventually is obviously teleological, most Jewish musicians would depart, either for economic reasons or to unite with extended family. Nonetheless, these musicians very much remained part of the soundscape even after their eventual departure for France, Israel, and Canada, and Latin America as well, whether through the continued playing of their records, through radio broadcasts, or because remaining musicians maintained the repertoire of those who left. At the same time, I think it need be mentioned that the path of musicians out and in to the Maghreb during this period, at mid-century, could be meandering as well. So if we take just one example, the iconic singer Sami al-Maghribi, whose daughter will be with us tomorrow and who I'll be interviewing on stage. If we take Sami al-Maghribi, again, arguably Morocco's most popular singer in the 1950s, Jewish or otherwise, we find a few things. The first is that he's actually out of the country in 1956. He's in France in 1956 and decides to return to Morocco during that period in and around independence at the initiative of a number of people, including the Sultan turned king. We also find that he will leave Morocco 3 years after Moroccan independence in 1959. He'll leave Morocco for France. But that doesn't mean that his affair with the Maghreb is over. So in 1960, for example, he will return to the Maghreb, not to Morocco, but to Algeria, then in the last 2 years of its war of independence, to perform there. And then he will also make a triumphant return to Morocco in 1967, just before the outbreak of the 1967 war. So 1959 was the year he departed Morocco, but not Sami al-Maghribi's definitive physical end in the Maghreb. And all of this to say that the movement of music and musicians, I think, reminds us that migration during this period was not necessarily unidirectional nor linear. Just as the music remained part of the soundscape in Morocco, even as musicians departed, I also want to make note, as many of you know, that the music of Morocco was transported to Israel as well, and physically also. So we know, for example, that Moroccan Jews immigrating to Israel, who will only have so much space in their suitcases, were bringing with them fragile 10 and 12-inch 78 RPM records to Israel from their homeland. So again, to think about diaspora and homeland here and what one brings with them. In addition, ethnomusicologists arriving in Israel in the 1950s and 1960s to record the folk music of Moroccan Jews before it, quote unquote, disappeared, inadvertently would capture something fascinating. So I'll give you one quick example, and then another example of something else, and then I'll stop. In 1957, the great Bengali ethnographer Deben Bhattacharya made a series of field recordings of Moroccan Jews recently arrived in Israel, and subsequently released them as an LP. It was a series of LP that some of you may remember called In Israel Today. It would be the music of the Jews from Morocco, the music of the Jews from Tunisia, etc. Now, the listener to this LP, the uninitiated listener, is led to believe that the totality of these tracks represents centuries-old Moroccan songs and almost timeless music that was sort of in its last moment of being captured. But something else was also happening. So on one track, for example, which he titled, Bhattacharya titled simply Arabic Romance, we find, for example, not an early modern qasida, but a fairly recent song of the Algerian Jewish artist Salim Halali, which was also still being recorded in the Maghreb at the time. So what Bhattacharya inadvertently captured was an intriguing case of a shared soundscape in Morocco, Algeria, and Israel just past the mid-20th century. Now, in Israel in the 1950s, we also find the rise of a nascent recording industry, which was mentioned by Tamar Sela in another panel, made for and by the North African Jewish community. Zakifon, Codifon, a number of labels that were initiated by the Azulai brothers out of Jaffa. This meant that newly minted Israelis of Moroccan origin were singing about Morocco in Israel after their departure from Morocco, and often in the form of a lament and often in the form of singing about exile. One example of an intriguing case of this comes from 1960. In that year, an earthquake will strike the Moroccan city of Agadir, killing some 12 to 15,000 of its residents, including 2/3 of the Jewish community there. A devastating event, national, international news. At that point, the Moroccan-born Israeli artist, who went by the stage name of Slimane al-Maghribi, will record a song about the Agadir tragedy for the Jaffa-based label Zakifon, And that record will then travel back to Morocco, along with other releases, Israeli releases of Moroccan music. Okay, so this is also at a time when the sort of the postal relationship between the countries is thought to not exist, or at least be very technically, legally difficult. The same is true with Moroccans who record in places like France, including, again, Sami al-Maghribi, whose far more popular and well-known recording about the Agadir earthquake will become something like an anthem that uplifts Moroccans in the aftermath of devastation. So all of this to say, the transnational nature of the recording industry or the music industry at this time, again helps us rethink not only the movement of Moroccans and their music, but also complicates somewhat the notion of homeland and diaspora, in which two artists, Jewish artists who take on the stage name of el-Maghribi, the Moroccan, and who are no longer in country, sustain a still considerable community of Moroccan Jews alongside Moroccan Muslims well after their departure. Thank you.